Hello and welcome to OAPA's AICP exam preparation webinar. I'm Aaron Ray, OAPA's Professional Development Officer. This webinar is intended for people who are interested in the AICP exam, as well as those who are preparing to take the exam. It offers practical advice from people who have passed the exam in prior cycles. This is an update to a program that OAPA originally delivered in fall of 2017. There are two sections to today's webinar. First, I'll give a brief update on how to become eligible and some options for applying for the exam. I'll talk about the content structure and how the exam was last refreshed in May 2017. Give some updated information on pass rate trends both in Oregon and nationally, and information about other resources that OAPA offers to help prepare for the exam. The rest of today's webinar will be a replay of last year's presentation by 3 panelists who successfully passed the AICP exam in May 2017. They'll talk about their insights on preparing to study and time management, study resources, content-specific study techniques, and then there'll be their panelist Q&A from that original webinar. If after today's presentation you have additional questions, feel free to reach out to your professional development officer. In Oregon, you can contact pdo@oregonapa.org for more information. Traditionally, people who wish to take the AICP exam needed to qualify for the exam by demonstrating that they had both education and professional planning experience sufficient to sit for the exam. The amount of professional planning experience depends largely on the type of degree that you received and whether or not it came from an accredited planning program. In 2017, a new sequence was added that allows candidates to sit for the exam immediately upon completing their education, then gain their professional planning experience before receiving the full AICP credential. Both of these sequences have the same overall cost once the sequence is complete. However, the candidate program requires a lower upfront fee. More information on eligibility is available on the American Planning Association website at planning.org/certification/eligible. It's important to consult the charts on these pages and compare them against your education and employment background to understand exactly how many years of professional planning experience you need and what sorts of professional planning experience qualify you to sit for the exam. The first step to sitting for the AICP exam is to apply. There are 2 application windows each year, one in June for exams in November and one in December for exams the following June. Full information on schedules, including exact deadline dates, are available on the American Planning Association website at planning.org/certification/current exam. It's very important to check this schedule so you understand the deadlines well in advance, prepare early, and gather required documentation. Documentation includes things often like copies of diplomas, certification of employment, and in some cases transcripts from your educational institution. It's important also to note the early bird application deadline. This is the advantage of an early bird application is that if an application is denied, you'll have the opportunity to resubmit any missing or incomplete information and still sit for that exam window. Once your application has been accepted, you'll be invited to register for the exam. Application decisions are sent to candidates by the end of September for exams in November and by the end of March for exams in June. You can defer one cycle, however, there is a fee that applies without having to reapply for the exam. So, for example, at the end of September, you could opt not to take the exam in November, but sit for the exam the following June. You'll need to make this decision or register for the exam by the end of October for a November exam or by the end of May for a June exam. Again, full details on deadline dates are available on the website. Once you've registered for the exam, carefully review test center procedures and arrive to the test center early. AICP is a computer exam delivered at Prometric testing centers. Prometric testing centers offer a wide variety of professional exams, and they have very rigid processes to ensure the integrity of the test environment. So make sure that you read things like what sorts of materials you are allowed to bring with you, and also dress in layers, as some of the test center rooms can be a bit cold. An unofficial score may be shown at the end of the exam, although this is not always the case, particularly in cases where the exam was just refreshed. The score shown at the end of the exam is simply an unofficial estimate of what your score is. Official score reports are mailed to candidates within 6 weeks of the exam. Even if your unofficial score report shows that you've passed, don't use the AICP credential until you have your certificate and official word from APA that you're cleared to use the credential. There are 5 main categories of questions included on the exam. Questions are arranged randomly throughout the exam. 25% of the questions, or about 38 questions, will be on fundamental planning knowledge. Things like the history of planning, the statutory basis and legal principles that underlie planning, natural, social, and economic systems, and human settlement patterns. About 30% of the exam, or 45 questions, will be on plan making and implementation. This will include the various stages of planning, from visioning all the way through implementation, research methods, spatial analysis, project management, and assessment. About 30% of the exam, or 45 questions, will cover specific areas of practice, and we'll get into that more in a moment. But this covers very specific specialized sector planning in both current and long-range scenarios. 5% of the exam, or about 8 questions, talk about leadership, administration, and management. This includes agency leadership, internal organization, and technology. 10% of the exam, or 15 questions, deal specifically with the AICP Code of Ethics and Professional Conduct. It's necessary to know the AICP Code of Ethics and Professional Conduct nearly verbatim. And in fact, one of the panelists in the presentation later in this webinar gives some specific advice on how to study for this very important section of the exam. The AICP exam includes questions that cover a very broad range of areas of practice, both in terms of types of planning, current and long-range planning, growth management, capital improvement programming, and urban design, among others. Different scales of planning, everything from rural and small-town planning all the way to sub-area or neighborhood planning, and a wide range of planning-related topics, including sustainability, hazard mitigation, economic development, housing, historic and cultural resources, and even more contemporary issues such as food systems and health planning. It's very important to review these areas of practice and understand where your existing knowledge gaps may be, and focus your attention on those areas as you prepare for the exam. The content and structure of the AICP exam was last modified in May 2017. It's important to remember that the May 2017 changes were simply a refresh of the exam. The exam was not fundamentally changed from its prior version. So, if you have study materials from the exam prior to May 2017, those may still be perfectly usable. But if you're going to be taking practice exams, it's important to understand where the differences lie so you can gauge for yourself where you may need to apply a bit more emphasis in your studying. The key changes to the exam were a simplified outline. The sections were reduced to 5 main sections that we went over earlier, and some simplified subcategories that really didn't change the breadth of the exam, but just made it a little bit easier to prepare for. Section weights, as I mentioned, were changed from, and the ethics section was doubled from 5 to 10%. I cannot stress enough the importance of understanding not only the letter of the AICP Code of Ethics, but also examining how you may apply it in certain professional contexts. The reading list, which is available on the APA website, was also refreshed with some new titles added and some old titles removed, but more emphasis is being placed now on Planning Advisory Service reports. It's important to remember that as an APA member, Planning Advisory Service reports are now available to you for free. There's a lot about the exam that did not change. The application and qualification process didn't change except for the addition of the AICP candidate process. All questions are still multiple choice, and there are still 170 questions, 20 of which don't count, but of course you don't know which 20 of those are test questions in the exam. Also, as in the old exam, there's the opportunity, once you're done answering all 170 questions, to leave an evaluation and feedback for the AICP board to use to evaluate the exam in the future. This slide shows updated pass rate information both in Oregon and nationwide. The green bars represent performance of Oregon candidates, and the red line shows the national trend. We're fortunate in Oregon that in almost all test cycles, our pass rate exceeds that of the national average. I don't have much to say to explain that other than I think that in Oregon, our planning system requires a higher level of fundamental knowledge than maybe in other states. You'll also notice that in 2017, in May 2017, when the exam was refreshed, our pass rates actually improved, and so did the pass rates nationwide. So that goes to show that while the exam was refreshed and reorganized, it didn't necessarily get harder than it was prior to the refresh. Finally, I want to touch on other exam prep resources and events offered by OAPA. AICP Exam is a program of OAPA's Professional Development Committee, so check the OAPA newsletter and the chapter's event calendar each spring and fall to see what the PDC has planned for AICP prep. The event calendar is available online at oregonapa.org/events, and you should be receiving the newsletter as an OAPA member in your inbox every 2 weeks. If you have more questions or need more information about upcoming events, you can also contact the chapter's professional development officer at pdo@oregonapa.org. Now I'd like to introduce the 3 panelists that will take us through the rest of today's webinar. All 3 of our panelists passed the AICP exam in May of 2017, and this webinar was originally recorded in fall of 2017. Lori Bunce, AICP, is a planner at Clean Water Services, a water resources management utility in Washington County. She works with the development community and the public to enhance the environment and quality of life in the Tualatin River watershed. Lori graduated with a Master's of Urban and Regional Planning from Portland State University, and Lori is a member of OAPA's Professional Development Committee. Kirsten Tillman, AICP, is an environmental and safety and security planner at WSP. She works in the transportation sector and gets particularly excited about transit projects. Outside of work, you can usually find her playing outside when the weather is cooperative, or playing board games inside when the weather is not. Kirsten is also the current president of OAPA. Josh Williams, AICP, graduated from the University of Southern California with a master's degree in urban planning. He worked in Los Angeles for over 10 years in the public and private sectors as a city planner and land use consultant, helping to shape the development of the city. He's currently a senior planner with the city of Gresham. He's written about urban planning, architecture, and development for 10 years, primarily for Curbed Los Angeles and Planetizen. He's also editor of the Oregon Planners Journal for OAPA, and he's currently serving as OAPA's communications chair. We'll start the webinar with Lori talking about the team's strategy to time management and study group preparation for AICP.
So that's what we did. Kirsten and Josh and I met to have a study group. We met once a month. That worked well for us. You guys can decide how often you want to meet if you do a study group. And then mapping your study plan. What I suggest doing, and worked well for me, was taking a pre-test at the beginning, which just kind of gave me a background of how much I knew already and where I would need to focus my energies on taking the test, and comparing that with the exam content that the APA provides in terms of content areas and the percentage that you're being asked, the percentages of the questions. And then the study schedule was helpful to set up at that point as well, where I was able to think about, based on how I did on the test and what the exam content was, I was able to put together a schedule that was pretty much, I would say, 8 hours a week of studying at the very beginning, working for a few months on that, and then once a month with the study group. And I think I found flashcards to be really helpful. So I'd read ahead, read the information, especially on the legal cases. That was really helpful. And then the last week before the exam, I took the time to focus on just a refresher. So looking at the flashcards, not trying to learn anything new, but just giving myself some time to study on that. The other thing that the APA suggests is to select an exam prep tool. I did not use an exam prep tool other than I did purchase the Chapter President's Council Study Manual from the Washington APA, but I know Kirsten and Josh used the Panelist exam prep class, and so they can offer some suggestions and insight into how that worked for them. And then the APA has a number of online resources that they suggest taking a look at. And I think the PAS reports were mostly helpful. In our study group, we divided the PAS reports up and each took 2 of them and then reported back. And I think what we found was that the executive summaries were really helpful. They're pretty long, up to 200 pages, I think. So it can be a lot to read, but breaking it up and just doing 2 and then reviewing the executive summaries as a group was helpful. And then the AICP Code of Ethics and Professional Conduct is really helpful. And I suggest knowing that pretty much word by word, but understanding the content of it as well. And Kirsten will talk more about that later on. And then as far as taking a practice exam, that's their last suggested step. And I think I probably took 2 or 3 of those at the very end, kind of during that refresher week for me. And it was helpful just to understand the questions or the framework for those questions. And so that's kind of from beginning to end as far as the APA and the AICP get certified steps and how it fit together for us. And we can ask or answer any questions along the way. I see that there is one question, what pretest did I use to map out my studying if I didn't purchase a study guide? So let's see here, there's a pretest available on the APA website under that pass the exam steps. You can download a brief exam. It's not a full exam set, but it does give you a fair number of questions. So I started with that. And then I think there might have been some exams in the Chapter President's Council Study Manual. And how many months did I take to prepare for the test? Let's see here. I honestly can't remember, but I think it was probably about 3 months. It seemed like it went by really quickly. And definitely there was 1 month in there that was a really concerted effort at studying. And with that, I guess we can move on to the resources.
All right, thanks, Lori. So this is Josh, and I am going to be talking about the resources that you may find useful as part of your study strategy for the AICP test. The majority of the resources I'll be discussing were used personally in my study, as well as the other participants in this webinar. I believe they also use many of these tools as well. So I will say that this is not a comprehensive list, and my strategy focused on where I thought I was weakest. So for those of you who do public sector planning for a city or county, your background and understanding of certain topics and even vocabulary might be different from those of you who have experience in private sector or in specialized fields, such as environmental planning, transportation planning, or economic development. My background comes from primarily the public sector, working for cities. So I focus less on entitlements and understanding concepts like floor area ratio or density calculations, and more on the areas where I knew that I had little to no experience. The best places to start are on the APA website, as Erin discussed. The AICP subject matter is important to know, so it will help to focus your study. Next, I suggest digging into the APA selected reading list and the 100 essential books of planning, also on the APA website. The books and reading materials on these lists are good to know, but I don't recommend reading the essential books unless you have the time and can absorb all that info. They're just good to know who wrote them, what they are, and have the general concepts about what they're about. Thank you. Of all the resources you'll be faced with, I'd suggest for me personally, the three most important are presented on the slide. And the best part about these resources is that they are free, however, with a caveat, which I'll go into a little later. First is the book Local Planning, Contemporary Principles and Practice from Gary Hack and a host of other contributors. It's also referenced as the Green Book, so you'll see that called out a lot if you're doing any of the Plan Edison courses or any of the other courses offered by some of the other chapters. So in my research, as I began studying, some people said that they read the Green Book from cover to cover. I made it through most of the book. I didn't read it cover to cover. Unfortunately, I made it through halfway, and then I started getting into stuff that I was more familiar with, so I kind of put it down. However, I did find it extremely, extremely useful for the test, so that's a hint that if you haven't got this book, you probably should look into it. The book covers a lot of the history, legal cases, and some of the important theories of comprehensive and strategic planning. Supplementing the Green Book, as Lori mentioned, the PAS reports and PAS memos from the APA's website. They can both be found under the Knowledge Center tab, which is on the main APA website, the front page there. So these included current planning issues like solar power and wind power, affordable housing issues, and public-private partnerships. For the PAS memos, they're fairly short and you can read through those pretty quickly. For the PAS reports, this was one of the strategies that Lori was mentioning. As part of our study group, we'd read one or two each and then come back and report to the other members of our group, giving a verbal and written sort of summary about what that report was about. But just in terms of approaching that, I wouldn't necessarily read the entire thing. Reading the intro and conclusion and maybe skimming through it is good enough. They're usually really, really dense and can take up a lot of your time that could be spent in other areas. As I said, all of these resources are free with the possible exception of the Green Book. I was able to download the Green Book through the Multnomah County Library. So I would suggest checking your local library and seeing if they have a copy, either a physical copy or a copy to download. That would be the best option for getting that rather than paying for it. The other primary resources I used was the Plan Edison AICP exam prep. And as a disclosure, I do occasionally write for Plan Edison, so I did get it at a significant discount. That being said, it was a really valuable resource for me in terms of organizing my study and figuring out just how to approach the content, because there's so much content out there that it really allowed me to focus on areas where I realized I needed help, and taking some of the practice exams through that was really useful. The other widely used product is AICP Exam Prep 3.0. So none of us in the study group use that tool. It's offered through the APA website, planning.org, and the link is down below. I did talk to a friend in California who used the Exam Prep 2.0, and she really thought it was useful, and she passed her exam just using that for her exam prep. She did say that the videos in that one are a little dry, so just be forewarned that you may have to watch some really boring videos. But both the Planetizen and AICP exam prep retail for about $245. Planetizen has several levels of pricing where it gets a little bit more pricey the more things that you toss into it. But I think going for the basic route and using their tests and their videos is really worthwhile. Moving on to secondary resources, I have to say that there's a lot of really good information on the web. Just be careful not to get overwhelmed. This is why taking practice exams is useful to find out where your knowledge gaps are and then targeting those areas. For me, I used a lot of free stuff to supplement what the Planetizen course and the reading list couldn't give me. So I watched probably a dozen AICP study seminars on YouTube presented by various chapters around the country. So you can find those pretty easily. The one I have on the screen right there is from the Illinois chapter. I've also heard that the Florida chapter does a really good one. There's stuff from New Jersey. You just kind of have to dig and you'll find them. And you really don't even have to dig, just do a quick Google search. I use StudyStack, which for those of you who are unfamiliar is digital flashcards that other test takers have put together to help with memorizing certain legal cases and terminology. I also use Wikipedia a lot for names and places. As I'd go through topics in my readings or practice exams, if I saw a name that I was unfamiliar with, Wikipedia was a good place to go. The Census Bureau website was also helpful for understanding demographic changes and terminology, and just understanding what the latest trends are from the last census, because those do turn up on the test. There's also another free AICP exam prep thing called planningprep.com. They do offer, first of all, it's free, and they do offer practice tests. Just reading some of the feedback from people that have used that, they say it's very simplistic. It just, it's basically they ask you a question and there's sort of a one-word answer. So it doesn't really follow what happens in the actual AICP test, but it is useful for kind of drilling down the information on names and dates and terminology. So as many of you have probably heard from your teachers, do not rely on a single source, especially StudyStack, which I think most of us in the study group used and found that it had a lot of errors. So please, just double check and check again and drill down on a lot of sources. What I heard from previous test takers and from the Planetizen site is that the test isn't getting into the minutia of case law and economic and organizational models. The way it was described, the test is broad, but it's not deep. So, I don't think they expect us, and from my experience, they didn't expect us to know, who the plaintiffs were in each of the cases and what the exact findings were. They want you to know what the case name is and what the concepts that came out of it were. So having an understanding of these topics is less about the details and more about the concept. My list of secondary resources is good to supplement your studies and drill down on concepts, but I wouldn't start here. For instance, you won't need to know the First, Fifth, and 14th Amendment to the Constitution verbatim, but you should know how they affect planning today and what legal cases they are related to. Similarly, for surveying and sampling, it's best to know the terminology and when one might be better than the other, but you won't need to know how to set up surveys or determine standard deviations. Lastly, I would suggest that you take practice tests early and then gauge your progress every few weeks. When you're falling short, focus on those areas, then take another exam and repeat the process. And hopefully some of these resources that I've discussed will prove to be as useful for you as they were for me. As Erin noted, copies of these slides will go out to you, and they should contain the active links to the resources that I mentioned today. So hopefully, these resources will help, and I'll be happy to answer any questions at the end. But now I'll turn it over to Kristen, who's going to be discussing the content specifics of the exam. Thank you.
Thanks, Josh. All right, so my job is to cover some of the, as was said, the content specific techniques. As you can probably tell by now, the exam is very broad and covers a lot of information, and we're like thinking that you're going to memorize everything verbatim, how it's written, is maybe not the best way to approach it. And so we already covered these PAS reports and a lot of these tips here, but one of the early mistakes that I made was when we decided to, as a study group, each cover a couple of the PAS reports and report back to the group. I spent like an entire Sunday reading my one report that was, I don't know, 150, 200 pages, and got to the end and realized I could have gotten the same exact information out of that if I would have spent a fraction of the time just going over those exam or the executive summaries using the memo. So kind of the content-specific technique lesson here is when you have something that goes really in depth that covers some of the exam content, to not let yourself go down deep into a hole. And I mean, we're planners, this stuff's really interesting. I kept telling myself, I wish I had time to read all this. But knowing when to pull yourself back out and know what you actually need to know for the exam. So focus more on the topics that you're less familiar with as well. This goes for the PAS reports and just kind of in general for the exam. And so much of studying for this particular exam is knowing where your weaknesses are and where to spend your time, because a lot of us are gonna we have full-time jobs, we're not, this isn't the only thing we're responsible for in our lives, and so time is limited, and being able to make the best of that. The next one is there are some more fact-based questions on the exam. There aren't as many as I necessarily expected at the beginning, but taking a bunch of the practice exams and learning more about the exam confirmed that there are some fact-based content. Most of these, the questions on the exam though, are like big meaty paragraphs that you have to digest. One, what's the question asking? And then two, figure out what answer from a list of could be answers is the best answer. And so knowing kind of like the hit list of what some of the more fact-based questions are available online, not only does that give you a chance to get kind of an easy point on the exam, but also it gives you a little bit of a encouragement when you're in the exam. You're like, okay, I know this one absolutely is fact-based. It's not a which one's the best answer one. These are just some examples. You're not going to necessarily be asked straight up like how many hectares are in an acre, or I mean acres in a hectare, but you might get some sort of pretty straightforward calculation question. And if you know that, you can whip that out right away and move on to the next question. So online, there'll be, you can find out what kind of these fact-based questions are. Any of those study resources that Josh went over should be able to provide this kind of information, but paying attention to those and then will help move on. We've talked a lot about law. This often is a subject that is really difficult to remember and to be able to cover, because there are a ton of law cases. And as Josh described, you don't really have to know the super details, but you really do need to know what the implications of the major cases are. Like which case established that aesthetics were a valid public purpose and something that we could regulate as planners. Understand which cases are associated with the 1st, 5th, and 14th Amendments, like Josh mentioned, and which ones are both 5th and 14th. And know which cases provide specific tools available to planners, like exactions or various tests that can be applied to cases to figure out if it's a valid use of policing power, for example. And then when you're reading through the cases, just really trying to understand the reasons for the case and the situation around what brought the case to court can sometimes help you remember what the case is actually about. And so this is an example, I'm obviously not going to read through all of it on the screen here, of how I divided up some of the cases to help me study. So after I read and studied the case, I pulled out the most important information that I found, and I bolded some of it, and also organized it by, was it a zoning case or an amendment, First, Fifth, 14th Amendment? Did it challenge the Constitution, that type of thing. And then for ethics, Lori mentioned as well, like you pretty much got to know this through and through. One approach is, and I certainly read through it multiple times, just the text of it. And then once I felt like I understood what was in it, I focused on more of, okay, how do I remember this and how can I apply it in the exam? And so the ethics, the code of ethics you'll find is broken up into 4 different sections. The principles to which we aspire, a key point there is you can't actually be, it can't be a subject of a code of conduct, a misconduct complaint. The rules of conduct are what you can be brought to in an ethics charge. And the important take-home message with the code of ethics too is that you only need to know what's in the code, but you need to know what's not in the code. For instance, the code does not cover something like sexual harassment. You know, we all know that's awful and that's bad, but it actually can't be the subject of a code of misconduct unless you're charged with it. And you'll find out that there are certain lists of illegal activity that if you're charged with this is a breach of the code of conduct, even if it's not explicitly listed in there. So I have on the next couple slides a few examples of charts from the Plan Editing course. I used that and found it super helpful. So this is breaking down that section B rules of conduct, and it takes what the value is that it's covered and then what the actual rule of conduct is. And I found this approach really helpful for the ethics and for a bunch of other subjects actually that the exam covers, because it first reminds you what it actually is covering and then specifically what that is. And again, if it's not on this list, it's not covered in the code of ethics, so there'll be questions on the exam, or you could at least get a question on the exam that covers an ethical thing and you know what the ethical response is, but the questions on the exam are not what's ethical, it's what is in the code of ethics. And here's another example of approaching the code of ethics and probably some law cases and other things is just charting it out. Anyone can seek an informal advice from the ethics officer, this type of thing, and mapping it out can help instead of just thinking about this big block of text. This type of stuff tends to be a lot easier to remember and also more applicable because you can figure out where you are in the chart and then figure out how to approach the question from there.
Thank you, Kirsten. So this is Aaron again, and I want to thank the panelists for providing the information that helped them be successful in their efforts to pass the exam in May 2017. I think they gave some really good advice and hopefully some helpful resources to everybody that's on today's session. We do have some time here for questions and answers. I know there were a couple earlier, but just to remind people how we're doing those, you can use Zoom's Q&A feature by clicking the Q&A button and then typing the question, and then we'll handle it as a panel. And I'd encourage anybody who does have a question right now to do that. I don't think we have any in the queue quite yet, but if you do have questions after the fact, you can contact me at pdo@oregonapa.org, and I can farm those out to the right person. And then there are also just some there's a link there to the APA site to talk about sort of just the logistics of how to get approved to take the exam, and what does it mean to get approved versus register, questions about when are you getting your exam results, things like that. So this will be the best time for Q&A. I want to introduce real quick Emma Johnson. Emma is a land use and environmental planner with Berger ABAM. She passed the AICP exam in 2014 and is a member of the OAPA Professional Development Committee. Emma is one of a couple of members of the PDC that help coordinate all of OAPA's webinars. So you'll be seeing more of her in the coming weeks, and she is going to take it from here and manage the Q&A.
Thanks, Aaron. So we do have a couple questions coming online, and I'll try and direct them to the appropriate panelists, but if anybody else has something they'd like to add, go ahead and do that. First question I would apply to all of you, and that is, what do you wish you had done differently in studying?
I'll answer that one first. I wish I would have stuck to my study schedule a little bit more. When the exam was a few months out, it was a lot easier. Like, I had gone onto I use Google Calendar a lot. I had gone on and blocked off like big chunks of time, like, well, not big chunks. I can't focus for more than a couple hours, especially after working a full day, but I had blocked off chunks of time in advance, and it was really easy several months beforehand to let a friend convince me to go out to dinner instead. And then when I got back down to it, some of the, that made my time that I had set aside just for refresher stuff cut into it. So I could only do a refresher of all the things that I covered for some of the topics, and I really wished I just had more time. So yeah, it's comprehensive, and giving yourself enough time in advance, and then really making sure you have time to go back through and not cover any more refresher information at least a week. I would have liked 2 weeks to do that.
I'll also answer. So I was kind of directionless for a couple of months at the beginning of my studies until I think starting to do the meet up with the other, with the study group, and then also the Panelist course. So I didn't actually take my first practice test until about a month before the test. And that kind of scared me a lot because I realized I didn't know as much as I thought I did. So I wish I had actually taken a practice test maybe 2 or 3 months ahead of time to really help me focus down. Because the last 3 to 4 weeks before the test were really brutal in terms of my studying to try and just take in as much info as possible. And it wasn't healthy. I wasn't sleeping a lot. You know, I was doing a lot of stay at work, which probably isn't good for my my review either. But you know, just take a test early, figure out what you don't know early, and study according to that. Don't wait to the last minute like I did. It was really awful.
I think the only thing I would add, this is Lori, is that I would probably have looked that book that Josh had mentioned, the local planning book, the Green Bible book. I remember I had read a little, maybe the first chapter or first couple chapters of that book, and I did find it really helpful. And I had, looking back on it, I think reviewing more of that content would have been helpful, particularly because I didn't use the Panelist or the AICP exam prep courses. So it was really looking just at what I had available to me that I wasn't purchasing necessarily. And the president's, the chapter president study manual was helpful, but it also was kind of rushly put together by the folks who put it together. And so there is some erroneous information in it or kind of incomplete thoughts. And so having that other guides and other books to supplement that would be really helpful.
I want to add one thing really quickly. This is Aaron. I know I'm kind of dropping in on the panelist here, but about the chapter president's guide, the guide was written for the old outline for the exam, and it has not been updated for the new exam outline. So If you're relying on that, I would also back it up with the updated reading list to make sure you are at least familiar with all of the concepts in those books. Or there are some exam differences videos that you can see at the APA's website. I'd make sure that you're familiar with those just to make sure you're getting a well-rounded set of study materials.
Okay, great. Next question we have is, how much should I plan on spending to get my AICP? And that's including exam prep and the actual exam fees. I know the exam fees are $425, registration is $70. There is also an option to transfer, and that's if you're coming up on your exam date and you're not feeling prepared or something else happens in your life, you do have an option for $100 of transferring that to the next window. Aaron, do you have anything to add on cost?
No, other than if upfront cost is an issue for you, you may want to consider waiting and looking at some of the options that the candidate program will provide, because it does have a lower upfront fee.
Great. And do we know off the top of our heads what the breakdown is for questions as far as multiple choice versus short answer?
All the questions are multiple choice.
Great. We have a few more, but one really interesting question that came through is, how long should somebody marinate on their career before committing to take the AICP exam?
Well, I guess if the question is in terms of how long should you be in a professional job before applying for the exam, I know I waited, I guess 12 years before taking the exam. And I think it just depends on how much experience you're getting. And I would say, for me, I thought I took the exam because I wanted to have the extra credentials and to kind of look more at the planning field and career for kind of long-term and as a way for continuing education. Those were kind of my motivating factors. So it wasn't so much as how long I'd been in my planning field already, but it might be worth everybody considering that. It might be just individual interests.
And I'll add to that from the the other end. I took the exam as soon as I qualified for the minimum requirements in terms of combination of education and experience. And that was for a couple of reasons. One, I feel like you're never going to get less busy, even if you think you might. And so I figured I might as well just get the studying and stuff out of the way. I also felt that the further I got away from my master's program, the more difficult it would be to get back into studying. And then the final thing was just raw calculating. One, I knew I wanted to be a planner, and I knew I wanted AICP, and two, my organization gives a pay bump, not just a bonus, but a pay bump for passing it. And so because it's a pay bump, it means that accrues every single year from here on out. I'm making a bit more money in salary by taking it earlier.
Josh or Aaron, do you have anything to add before we move on?
Not really. I kind of had the same experience as Lori. I waited 10 years after graduating from my master's to do the AICP. I had a friend who I worked with who did it, as soon as she was able to cobble together the work experience and the requirements. So she did it, 10 years ago. I think I don't know that there's any need to wait if you feel like you're ready. It's just a matter of, studying. And some of the stuff is fresh in your mind out of grad school or undergrad. I don't see why it necessarily wouldn't be a right time to do it now for you.
Okay, thanks. We have had a couple questions that are looking into the benefits of becoming certified and how has that benefited your career. For me, that has primarily been networking, and then it is nice to have something holding you accountable for staying up to date on legal issues and current planning issues, and the requirements for continuing education sort of provide that reasoning for you to keep up. Lori, do you have anything to add to the benefits of being an AICP?
Well, since I just got the certification and just recently this year, I couldn't speak to it over the long term, but certainly I would echo your thoughts on the continuing education piece and being held accountable for that. I think also it's encouraged me to be more involved in the Oregon chapter of the APA, and so that also would be following along on the same concept of the networking.
Josh or Kirsten or Aaron, anything to add on the benefits?
I agree with Lori. It's a little too soon for me to know if, in terms of job prospects, if it will improve my job prospects, because I'm in a pretty good place right now and don't plan to move for a while. But I think the continuing education has always been important to me, and I've always tried to be active in APA to some degree. So I think this is kind of one of those next steps, and just making sure, I'm getting as much education and putting into the organization as much as I'm getting out of it.
Okay, and then here's another one for the entire panel, and that is, did you personally have any topic that you wish you had studied longer for or regret not concentrating on?
This is Lori. I think, trying to think back to the test, but I think there may have been a couple statistics questions that I was kind of had to think about a lot harder than I would have liked to, perhaps. And it was conceptual. It wasn't any detail, but that may have been something I would have preferred to look back on more.
And I'll add, this isn't exactly, it's kind of answering the question opposite, but we didn't address this directly. At the beginning of the webinar, Aaron had the slide up where it showed the percentage of each subject that the exams covered and about how many questions you can expect. And so you have some of the big ones, like the areas of practice that you might be getting like 45 questions on. Then you had the management one that was 5%. And in my head, I was like, oh crap. Like when I read that topic, I'm not up, those types of questions are really for people who are in the public agency, like gonna be managing people. And I was like, well, I don't really even know if I'm on that trajectory, but I certainly don't have that experience now, that's for sure. And it was tempting to spend a lot more time on that because it was definitely the topic or the area that I was least familiar with. But I was only gonna get up to 8 questions, or around 8, maybe 10 questions on the exam. So I was actually glad I didn't spend more time on that. I got, I don't know, 3 or 4 out of 8 questions on that. But then on the topics I spent a lot more time on, even though I was more familiar with it, I got more like 43 out of 45 questions, right? And so the every time you're evaluating what topic to study, it's helpful to go back and remind yourself what how much the exam is weighted in that area to give yourself a gut check on how much time you're spending on it as well.
Yeah, I would agree with Kirsten as well on the leadership and management thing. I think some of them, I just hadn't even gone into some of the deep dive in some of those sections on like human resources. I had a couple of questions on that, which I don't think anyone else did that I talked to. I was just kind of like, I have no idea, and so it was kind of a random guess. I don't know that I'd necessarily spend a lot more time, or that I regret not spending more time on that, because I think, as Kristen was saying, there's other areas that had more questions, and that really I think I spent, used my time more wisely looking at those other sections.
Okay, thanks. As a reminder, if we don't get to your question, or if you come up with one later that you would be interested in having the panelists answer, you can email that to PDO, which stands for the Professional Development Organization, at OregonAPA.org. So Aaron, I think the final question should be for you, and that is, will the webinar slides be available after the webinar?
They will be. As I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation today, this has been a little bit of a technical dry run for the PDC as well as it is for the entire, for all of us, I guess. So we will be making the slides available. It turns out that there may be a glitch with the recording, but I think that we have most of today's panel. Certainly, we might not have the part that I gave at the beginning with the administrivia, but we have all the panel dialogue and the Q&A certainly recording. So what we're going to do is prepare all of that information, and that will be included in the evaluation survey email, which will be sent out to everybody who registered for the webinar, and you should expect that email in the next couple of days. So yes, we'll be making all of this information available. Also, I believe we have a number of other questions that were submitted, and what we'll try and do, I'll circulate those amongst the panel and see if we can get written answers to those, and we can circulate those out to the entire group. So being mindful of everybody's time, it's pretty much the top of the hour. I want to say thank you to everybody who joined us, and thank you for sticking with our little bit of our technical glitches. But we hope that this was useful and that you'll be ready to take your exam either in November or next year. And we hope that you'll join us for another APA webinar later this year. We'll be having AICP application processes, as well as a couple of other webinars we're working on, including one for technical tools, and I think there may be some ones about some housing updates that are coming as well. So thank you for joining us, and we hope to see all of you soon.